Welcome back, everyone. It is 11/11 of 2015. We're going to take a look at Aristotle again in this lesson. We're going to take a look at his treatise on the ethics. And one thing we can be very thankful for is that his treatise on the ethics became a foundational document for Christian theology and Christian ethics and even Christian epistemology. And the Church Fathers did rely heavily on Aristotle's treatise on the ethics. So we must remember that this document made a major contribution to the history of Christian theology and its development. And especially with Brother Thomas Aquinas, who told us and told his generation and future generations that there is one truth from one God, and that there is no lack of correspondence. In truth, if there is, it's a failure on our interpretation. There is one truth, one God, and Aristotle can be interpreted, and was interpreted by Brother Thomas, as a Christ-centered presentation to be integrated into the Scriptures and interpreted through the Scriptures. And so the Treatise on Ethics became a foundational document for Brother Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologia, basically his systematic theology. Used this volume quite a bit. So we're going to take a look at this, and we're going to look at it in Aristotle's own words. But we need to remember as a backdrop that this is very much a foundational Christian document. We're going to take a look at basically chapters 1 through 6, which Aristotle titles books 1 through 6. Technically they're chapters, but we're going to look at 1 through 6 on the treatise on the ethics. And we'll look at it within the concept of the good. We're going to look at the good in itself, the good going out of itself, the good for another, entering into the realm of the practical, and then the good as a return back into the soul of the intellective self. So basically we're going to look at it in these moments. We're going to start with block 1, the good in itself, as the structure of the eidos and the general aspects. There are two types of actions. There are acts of working, and there are acts beyond actions. In other words, acts that have an eschatological end, which is universal and absolute, the absolute end of the kingdom of God. So some acts are going to be eschatological and point to and participate in the kingdom of God. The species of actions are abbreviated under the genus of faculty. So it's the faculties of the soul that will actualize these actions toward the kingdom of God. And there is an imperative to outline the chief good, or the absolute good. The political act as an end is the generic concept for ethics, and this political ethics is going to be communal and individual. The good of man as end abbreviates nobility and justice. So those become generic central concepts for Aristotle, the concept of nobility and the concept of justice. And justice is going to be very important when we get into the realm of practical positing. Justice takes on a central role for Aristotle. Our preliminary triad of ethics consists of the fact that the self is a student and potentiality. And then 2, we are a self that observes our external reality and then internalizes the spiritual truth that we perceive, the eidos forms that are the first principles. And then we will end up positing an ethical end of trying to bring forth the ideal. Our outline of the chief good employs a twofold intellect. Aristotle tells us we have a possible intellect of what we may know, and we have an active intellect of what we already do know. So our intellect, which is the higher soul for Aristotle, is divided into the possible and the actual, the possible and the active. But it is the higher or the essential soul that lives on through eternity for Aristotle. We begin with the active intellect that is already in possession of acquired first principle forms, eidos forms. We all have some eidos forms that we've already acquired in our life. These eidos forms and any additions must pass through the modality and category. And so modality will be basically threefold. The eidos forms will initially pass through the sentient soul, the sensate senses of the self, the social realm of the self, and then the eidos forms will pass into the intellective soul. So it's a threefold step of the processing of these ideal eidos forms in reality. Now, as far as category goes, once we do acquire this eidos form, it's a category. But the category also has to pass through three stages. It begins in the intellective soul as the ideal substance of eidos. It then has to pass through the habits of virtue, and then it has to become practical as practical wisdom, as phronesis, and then practical action as praxis. And so, even once we do acquire the categories, we can't just hold on to the categories in kind of an ideal realm of memory and keep them closed in. We're supposed to actualize the categories that we do acquire. The eidos forms we acquire need to be actualized. So basically, according to Aristotle, the eidos form is going to develop through the sentient soul, the social dialogue, the intellective soul, and then we're going to acquire that eidos form. But then it has to be defined as a universal substance, and then it will enlist the habits of virtue in order to become practical and become a praxis of action. So how does the good go out of itself? And that's our block 2, and it is through the having and exerting of reason for Aristotle. The good goes out of the self as a having and exerting of reason. It's always reason as central for Aristotle. Now the eidos principles are twofold. They are independent, or they can be employed as instrumental principles as well. The eidos forms can be independent as part of the sign model, or they can be instrumental forms within our sign model. The object of our eschatological goal of the kingdom of God is our object of teleosis, and it is the absolute final good of God's kingdom. So subjectively, this final good also includes the imperative to define a self, to really work on and achieve a mature self-identity of what it means to be a human being, a mature human being. The ethical work of the self equals the positing of the intellective soul, which is that higher, more noble soul. So we're going to go out of ourselves by positing this intellective soul that has grasped and taken hold of these eidos forms and formed a sign model of how we perceive the kingdom of God. So we're going to posit the acquisition of the intellective soul. Our practical ethic becomes equal to a demonstration of our sign model. We want to demonstrate the practical actualization of our first principles as these eidos forms, which are a plurality of eidos forms, but we enclose them within a holistic unity as a sign model that becomes our picture, our internal sketch, our internal schema of what the kingdom of God looks like in our reality, or what we hope it will look like, what we want to work toward and actualize. We form an eidos form sign model of a plurality of eidos forms enclosed within a singularity, which becomes a singularity of our sketch of the kingdom of God. So we have our kingdom of God sketch, and we have a little bit of a triad at the bottom of block 2 we need to take a look at. Block 1, the intellect, we begin with the eidos forms in the active side of the intellective soul, but the possible side of our intellect is ready to acquire even more eidos forms to add to the ones we already possess. Then we have to enter into modality, because those bare eidos forms have to pass through the modalities of, they had to go through the sentient soul, the social dialogue, and the intellective soul in order to reach category. In order to become true categories, they had to pass through every aspect of this sentient soul, intellective soul, and we do get involved in social dialogue and refining the universality of an eidos form. Our social dialogue helps refine these ideal eidos forms. And then we reach category. So block 3 is category, but once we reach category, it must pass through those 3 stages And the three stages are the in itself of substance. In other words, we want to define it as the ideal, eidos form. But then it has to go out of itself as for another, for those in our community. And then we will receive it back as a praxis return. And once it returns back to the self, it can become a force as a first principle. It's no longer just an eidos form. Once it passes through mission and becoming concrete in our community as trying to actualize the kingdom of God, and then the surplus of spirit returns to us, and we take that back into the intellect of soul, we refine it as now a validated and an authenticated eidos force rather than just an eidos form. It becomes a eschatological force that helps to drive the kingdom of God forward, and it does that not only in history, but it does it within the subjective intellect of soul. So it comes back into our soul and becomes an eschatological force for moving forward the kingdom of God. So we've got this category, we've got this group of categories, we've formed a sign model, but now we know we need to move on to being for another. We can't just stay in the ideal, we have to become practical. So we have to become for another, says Aristotle. You can't remain closed up within the self. You have to go out of the self, and you have to let these ideal eidos forms become practical and then help actualize the good. We've got to move out of the true and move into the practical good. So this is the birth of ethics for Aristotle. Block 4, we've worked on the ideal in block 1 and 2. Now we're going to take the ideal truth that we formed as a sign model, and Aristotle says we're going to now go out of ourselves for another, for the community, and we're going to give birth to ethics. We're going to give birth to an ethics of what he calls the good. He just calls the absolute the good. We're going to get involved in an ethics of the good, but we need to enlist our virtues in order to enact this ideal sign model. So block 4 is going to be the good for another as the way of virtue, and there are 6 aspects of the habits of virtue. We transition from the categories to being for another through an inclination toward the pleasure of trying to, it's a pleasure for us to try to actualize the ideal of the true eidos forms. And it will include the enlistment of any instrumental means or any instrumental goods that we might need. It constitutes an extension of the soul, this is called a working of the soul. It's a working of the intellect of soul for Aristotle. It's 2-stage. Our truth of categories must pass through the 2 stages in being for another by being complete virtue and by being complete life. Complete virtue, which we enlist here in block 4, and complete life, which will be 5 and 6. Now the way of virtue divides into 2 practical classes or stages. So when we enlist these virtues, we're going to move through 2 steps. And the 2 steps are going to be phronesis as practical wisdom and praxis as the act of existence, of positing that act of existence. So what we've got coming up is phronesis and praxis. Now note 2, out of the state of the mean are generated the 6 moral virtues, and for Aristotle they all fall under the categories of honorable, expedient, and pleasant. And he says there are 6 virtues, and they're all based on the relational mean, which means they're not deficient, they're not excess, but they're the middle relational mean, which is the ideal place to be with any virtue. And they are courage, temperance, generosity, the character of humility and passion, or just character, truthfulness, and friendliness. And I'll read them again, but basically it's courage, temperance, as far as the passions go, generosity, and then character. Now character is going to be humility and passion, and it's going to be truthfulness and friendliness. And so he says we're going to enlist these 6 virtues in order to enact our ideal sign model of how we perceive the absolute good, or in Christianity, the kingdom of God. We're going to actualize it by enlisting our 6 virtues. But it's 2 stages, it's phronesis and praxis. So we're going to take a look at block 5 and 6. Now in block 5, we're going to look at the good for another, going out of itself as for another, as deliberation and choice. Note one, deliberation as phronesis, or practical wisdom. We deliberate over practical matters that are within our own power to enact. We consider the intellective soul, and our deliberation enjoins the threshold of dialogue with others. We address the means for actualizing our sign model of the true. Now we're looking for the means to help us enact that sign model to bring forth the absolute good of the kingdom of God. And this determined ethical practical preference will inform our praxis act of existence. So this preference of deliberation is determined through a triad, which is basically, we begin with the categories, that eidos sign model that underlies the act we want to enact, and then we're going to move through this phronesis of deliberation to enlist the practical means to create our act. And then we're going to move on to the act, which is going to be the praxis of choice, and we will critique the deliberation with the first principles of the universal eidos forms and form a positive act of existence. And so let's talk about that, forming that act, that choice. That's going to be note 2, the choice guided by the axiom that all virtue in justice is comprehended. So all virtue is in justice comprehended. So that's that term where I said that justice plays such an important role for Aristotle. Justice matures the 6 virtues. The 6 virtues become mature and authentic and true to God's kingdom through the concept of justice. Now, A, the just self is lawful and equal. The law, as the imperative of praxis, tells us that virtue is perfected in justice. And subjectively, this means that the self must bear the rule of justice in the community. And justice becomes coextensive with all of our virtues. And at the very specific level of praxis, justice has a twofold meaning. It's the distribution, the equal distribution of honor and wealth within society, and it is dikaiosune righteousness concerning judgments of equality. So it's righteousness, literally it means righteousness that divides things in 2 parts of equality. A righteous distribution of goods, wealth, honor, and voice to members of society. It's the justice of equality. And that will mature our virtues as we go out of ourselves to posit the good based on our true sign model. So that takes us to block 6. That's going to be the good as return out of the syllogism of demonstration. We have an intellective return. Our posited praxis of good is always the making of something beyond the self, always in anticipation. It will engender a return of a surplus of the ideal eidos, of the spirit, which is returned back into the intellective soul. There's always a surplus in the realm of the spirit. God's greater than anything we could conceptualize. There's a practical return because eidos, after having passed through the syllogism of demonstration that we've just gone through, becomes verified and validated, and we get that eidos return of that force that's going to become an empowerment that will go back into our phronesis to empower this process of moving toward the kingdom of God. So look at the little triad in the lower right corner. You can see in block 1 we've got the eidos, or the categories, and then 2 we've got that deliberation of phronesis, and that leads to the praxis of choice. But there's 2 returns out of our activity in the realm of the spirit. The return of the ideal of the surplus of God's spirit back into the intellective soul and the eidos categories, but a return of force back into the phronesis of enacting the kingdom of God, our participation and mission. And so there's a return of eidos, there's a return of force. So you can see that Aristotle has given the church fathers, and he's given us a tremendous foundational truth to enlist and to assist us in Christian doctrine concerning ethics and in Christian doctrine concerning epistemology. And it was certainly taken up by the church fathers, especially Thomas Aquinas. But it's become popular again today because Brother Thomas emphasized the philosophy of mind. He interpreted Aristotle's philosophy of mind in his book on the soul, And today, the philosophy of mind is very prevalent. It's called first philosophy or first theology. And in the Christian theology circles and in the Christian philosophy circles today, philosophy of mind is very dominant. It's just called first philosophy. But it has very much repopularized Aristotle, and it's made Thomas Aquinas even more popular today than in recent years. And so there's a tremendous resurgence of going back and looking at Aristotle and looking at his treatise on ethics and looking at his treatise on the soul. And we've already gone over his treatise on the soul, but now we're taking a look at his treatise on the ethics. And it was a tremendous blessing. We've got a chance to look at the good as the eidos forms in themselves. But then they became categories. But when they became categories, after passing through the sentient soul, the social dialogue, and the intellective soul, they couldn't remain in the self. Aristotle said they have to go out of the self for the community, for others. They need to be for another. We had to do that by what? By enlisting our virtues in order to enact our ideal sign model. And Aristotle says we have 6 virtues that we enact to assist us in enacting this ideal of the kingdom, or what he calls the ideal of the absolute eternal good. We do that by deliberating over what can we do at a practical level? What means are available to us? Who can I enlist? What resources can I enlist to actualize this ideal that I see for the kingdom of God going forward? Once we determine that, then we posit a very specific concept of what Aristotle says is of justice. We posit a very practical and very precise positing of the good, but it's generically abbreviated under the concept of justice, which is equality, basically distribution of equality for Aristotle. That's the definition of how we're to participate in bringing forth the kingdom of the absolute good, or what we call, as believers, the kingdom of God. And then he closes out with his little model of eidos, phronesis, praxis. And it's just a great way to remember his ethics. Just remember the triad of eidos, phronesis, praxis. Eidos, phronesis, praxis. And you've got a great little memory tool there to remember his ethics. That'll wrap up the treatise on the ethics by Aristotle.